Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
All insurance plans are required to cover preventive care at no cost.
I mean, where's the oppression coming from here? Who's trying to use the law to impose morality on people? It ain't the Catholic Church, it's the secular state.
Churches, houses of worship are exempted from this policy.
And I find it totally offensive that we are subject to accommodations and grandfather clauses. You can't accommodate and you can't grandfather clause the First Amendment.
Today, the issue of religious liberty captures more headlines than ever. Tension is growing.
In Virginia's Ten Commandments controversy, a high school has changed the display of the religious document.
A new development in that controversy over prayer during the graduation service at Medina Valley High School in Castroville.
Will we be able to live according to our faith and conscience?
Can the federal government step into a religious institution and redefine their doctrine for them?
I don't think that a bunch of guys, a bunch of men on this committee should be making the decision as to whether contraception is available.
It gives a feeling to those of us who aren't of a particular religion that we're not as important and we don't really matter.
The freedom of religion, it is the bedrock upon which this nation was founded. If we lose it, we lose America.
Intersections. Can you imagine what an intersection would look like if there were no signs or signals to keep traffic flowing safely? It's the same for the intersection of church and state. With the signs and signals of the First Amendment in place, the traffic flows safely. When they're ignored, collisions occur. Today, there are a lot of collisions. Hi, I'm Gregory Seltz. In this program, constitutional experts, a former senator, and church leaders will examine the intersection of church and state. Let's start where it all began, in Philadelphia. In this very room in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and on this very table, the Declaration of Independence was signed. That document declared that there are certain rights that are not within the power of the government to either grant or take away. In the Bill of Rights, the document which declared what those unalienable rights were, the first 16 words were about religion. George Washington said religion was an indispensable support of political prosperity. Religion is the first topic of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. Religious freedom is the first right recognized by the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The first clause has come to be called the Establishment Clause. It prohibits Congress from designating an official religion. The second clause has become known as the Free Exercise Clause. It says that Congress cannot make laws preventing people from practicing their faith according to their conscience. What do you think when you hear claims that people of faith are not to be active in the public square, or that the government should be secular, unmoved by religious sentiments at all, or claims that the federal government has the right to limit religious freedoms in certain instances?
I think it's good separation because you want to make sure that you don't let the politics and people's religious beliefs, kind of intersect. We have a diverse nation right now, so I think it's a good idea to keep them separate.
They should be separate because I think otherwise it doesn't blend good together because you have a conflict of interest a lot of times.
I'm a big believer in separation of church and state. I think that, it's perfectly fine and even, reasonable for people to be guided by their moral values. I don't particularly care where those moral values come from.
They're always saying that Christians need to be quiet. We're trying to hinder other people, but a lot of times they're trying to hinder us. And so when they talk about separation of church and state, I don't think they actually know what it means.
But doesn't the Constitution mandate that there should be a wall of separation between church and state?
When we talk about the wall of separation, I contend that it's more of a red herring than anything.
It's not a part of the Constitution itself, but it has widely been attributed as a characteristic of the First Amendment.
Surprisingly, the phrase wall of separation is actually not in the Constitution. So where did the expression wall of separation come from? In fact, the term came from Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, in a letter to a group of Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut.
And the Baptists celebrate Jefferson because they knew that when Jefferson was a leader in Virginia, he had championed the rights of religious minorities, including Baptists. And the Baptists in New England are struggling under the domination of the Congregationalist Church, which enjoys legal favors in New England.
So the Danbury Baptists write to Jefferson complaining about their situation. That religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as unalienable rights.
And it's in response to this letter that Jefferson writes back to the Danbury Baptists, again, expressing solidarity with them in their aspirations for religious liberty. But he also uses this language. He speaks of the First Amendment as having built a wall of separation between church and state. And it's through this letter that this metaphor of a wall of separation enters into American political vernacular.
Jefferson responded, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions," he continued quoting the First Amendment, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So it was Thomas Jefferson's way of describing the First Amendment of the Constitution to a group of Baptists in Connecticut that birthed the metaphor wall of separation.
I would suggest to you that Jefferson's use of the metaphor was essentially an affirmation of this principle of federalism, that matters of religion are to be left to religious societies, individuals, and to the extent necessary to state and local governments. And it's a matter that the federal government was to have no dealings with.
Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor was not mentioned in a Supreme Court case concerning the Establishment Clause until 1947, when Justice Hugo Black wrote the majority opinion in Everson versus Board of Education.
The court embraced that famous metaphor of Thomas Jefferson, the metaphor of a wall of separation, but they took it a step further. They said that the First Amendment had erected, in the court's words, a high and impregnable wall of separation. And then they concluded by saying, we could not approve the slightest breach. And it is this rhetoric from the court, 1947, that has, I think, impacted so many policies, so many government actions today, limiting and restricting the place and role of religion and people of faith in public life.
Today, this metaphor has become the common expression of the way people understand the First Amendment's impact on how church and state relate. But does Jefferson's wall and Hugo Black's embellishment do a disservice to the First Amendment? Justice William Rehnquist thought so.
It is impossible to build sound constitutional doctrine upon mistaken understanding of constitutional history, but unfortunately, the Establishment Clause has been expressly freighted with Jefferson's misleading metaphor for nearly 40 years. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, in France at the time the constitutional amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were passed by Congress and ratified by the states. His letter to the Danbury Baptist Association was a short note of courtesy, written 14 years after the amendments were passed by Congress.
Considering his absence, Justice Rehnquist noted that Jefferson would be a less than ideal source of contemporary history as to the meaning of the religion clauses of the First Amendment.
But the problem is if we replace the language of the First Amendment with this wall of separation metaphor, a wall is a bilateral barrier. It not only inhibits things moving from one side to the other, but from the other side to the first side. And that changes fundamentally the restrictions of the First Amendment.
We could have called it a line in the sand, or a partition, or a short fence that I like to refer to as, where you can still cooperate, religion and government.
So if the metaphor wall of separation does not describe what the writers of the First Amendment were thinking, what was their intent? To understand this, we must first understand the context of why the First Amendment was added to the original Constitution. Whom did the founders seek to limit, and whom did they seek to set free? The first draft of the United States Constitution was composed in 1787 here in Philadelphia, and copies were sent out to the states to be ratified. It ran into a major roadblock when many of the 13 states wouldn't ratify it. Rhode Island and North Carolina refused to ratify it unless it included a Bill of Rights. 5 out of the remaining 11 states proposed amendments that provided for individual liberty. With fears surrounding the possibility of an unchecked, unlimited federal government, they sought instead to guard the rights of the individual, especially the religious, moral, self-governing citizen. Ratification of the Constitution came about due to James Madison's promise that there would be a Bill of Rights forthcoming. Eventually, a list of amendments was added to the Constitution, the first 10 making up what is called the Bill of Rights. It's the First Amendment, which includes what is known as the Establishment Clause, that receives most of the attention. But maybe the clause would be better described as the Congress Limitation Clause, ensuring the liberty of individuals and religious organizations from the tyranny of the federal government. Here is the full wording of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. If you look closely, the First Amendment does not grant religious liberty. The founders assumed that people had these already from God.
Freedoms in the First Amendment are not granted by the Constitution. They are prohibited from being infringed upon.
America's traditional understanding of these rights is that they are not granted by the Constitution, they're not granted by the government. They are, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights, and that the human race, individual men and women, are endowed with these rights by their Creator, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it all comes from God. It doesn't come from an act of government.
And I think it's important, it distinguishes America from any other country on the planet that I know of, that we acknowledge that certain fundamental rights come from our Creator, not from government, not from man.
One might say that this is not a get religion out of the public square amendment. This is a tell Congress to mind its defined business amendment. So the original intention of the First Amendment was to protect any religion from the federal government, and was added because of pressure from the states that feared the interference of government in the church and in an individual's right to religious freedom. The need to limit the powers of the federal government was not only influenced by these immediate concerns, it went back further to the influence of recent European history, a history the Founding Fathers were only too familiar with. In 1785, James Madison, who along with George Mason, who wrote the first draft of the Bill of Rights, wrote this in a reply to a bill that was being proposed by the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Torrents of blood have been spilt in the old world by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord.
Memories of European wars rooted in an environment of state-controlled religion were still fresh in the minds of the Founding Fathers. It was only natural for the colonists to fear that the federal government's manipulation of religious differences, which had fueled centuries of bloodshed in Europe, that such manipulation would follow them to the shores of America. Ironically, some of that did begin to happen. Religious groups like the Pilgrims, which were persecuted in England, crossed the Atlantic and became state church leaders of the colonies. In fact, it may surprise you to know that 8 of the original 13 colonies had an officially established church. And if you belong to a minority religious group in one of those states, you found the situation in America not much different from what you left behind in England.
I think many people don't know that for several years after our Constitution was ratified and after our Bill of Rights was ratified, several states had their own officially established churches. They fled England to get away from that. But you know, sometimes I guess people like to test out being king when they have the opportunity. At any rate, those fell by the wayside when people like Madison and Jefferson argued against that kind of thing.
Unfortunately, there are a number of stark examples in American history of state-imposed religious persecution being inflicted by government officials misusing their power. For instance, in 1773, 27-year-old Jeremiah Moore ran afoul of the law, but in a very unique way. He had grown up a member of the state church, but 2 years earlier, he converted to the Baptist church. He was arrested in Alexandria, Virginia, and thrown into jail. His crime? Preaching without a license he could only acquire from the established state church. In fact, Moore would be arrested and imprisoned 2 more times for preaching the Baptist version of the Christian faith. Misuse of ecclesiastical and governmental power can be seen also in the case of Mary Dyer, an English Puritan turned Quaker. She had been banished 3 times from the colony of Massachusetts, which was a Puritan state, for preaching Quakerism and protesting on its behalf. On her return to the state for the 4th time to protest an anti-Quaker law, she was arrested and sentenced to death. On June 1st, 1660, Mary Dyer was hung, a day after her sentencing. Abuse of governmental and ecclesiastical power is not unique to the American experience. History is full of examples of both religious and secular state abuse of power, even abuse of one's citizens. What is unique is the American remedy, the first 3 words of the Constitution: we the people. The First Amendment located the potential solutions in a unique place: people like you and me, free, self-governing, religious, moral citizens, and not the heavy hand of the federal government. This was not a new concept. In the 16th century, Martin Luther proposed a new way to understand the intersection of church and state that James Madison and the other founders would have known quite well. In 1821, James Madison received a letter from a pastor in New York named Reverend Friedrich Schaeffer. Schaeffer included excerpts of an address he had made at the laying of a church cornerstone in New York. In a portion of the address, Schaeffer had referred to Martin Luther.
It illustrates the excellence of a system which, by due distinction, to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way, between what is due to Caesar and what is due to God, best promotes the discharge of both obligations.
What Madison was referring to was a well-known teaching of Martin Luther called the Two Kingdoms that provided a biblical basis for church and state operating in different spheres but interacting for the benefit of human welfare.
There is something about this distinction that Martin Luther had between the 2 kingdoms or the 2 realms or the two states or estates, and there's a kind of particular genius in that.
Luther's teaching of the 2 realms is not exactly like the separation of church and state as we've come to understand it in recent decades. These 2 realms are sort of permeable. One person lives within these 2 realms. The one realm has to do with the Word of God, where the Word of God governs and rules. The kingdom of the left, the state, the civil realm, is about home, family, reason, laws that govern reasonable existence, protect vulnerable life, etc.
Left-hand stuff, God essentially is holding a lid on things, keeping things from unraveling too much, and working according to justice. In the right hand, God is working for full redemption, justification, and the goal there is grace, deliverance and forgiveness of sins in Christ. So there's kind of like two different things that God is accomplishing.
These two realms are an extraordinary expression of the deep biblical teaching of Jesus and St. Paul. St. Paul says that we are to be subject to rulers and authorities because they beareth not the sword in vain. That means if you do something wrong, you'll be punished. The church has no business punishing anybody. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Jesus did not come to establish an earthly kingdom. Jesus did not come to establish a church that would rule the secular realm. The church is about the Word of God, the delivery of forgiveness.
It's really the living out of these two kingdoms that really puts both religion in its place and puts the state in its place. And I say that in a very positive way.
It's Luther's concept of the two kingdoms that later informs the system developed by the Founding Fathers for negotiating the intersection between church and state. Our nation's founders struggled to find a way to prevent a collision between church and state. What they came up with was an incredibly intuitive solution, one that would bind the federal government to very limited powers, and one that would guard the freedom of the individual self-governing citizens. It was established on a foundation of reason, a morality evident in the laws of nature or natural law, and a morality informed by religious values.
The American founders looked to religion and a morality informed by religious values to promote the kind of social order and stability that they need. They believe religion's going to provide that internal moral compass that will prompt citizens to behave in a disciplined fashion. And this is an idea that is expressed over and over again in the political literature of the American founding.
You have, for instance, Adams saying, "Our particular form of constitutional democracy can only work with a religious and moral people."
Throughout history, presidents, congressmen, senators, the leaders of our country in both the public and private sector have been men and women of faith.
And for the Founding Fathers, even the morality of the limited state was underpinned by common sense, the morality seen in creation and their religious beliefs, many which were compatible with Christianity.
Jefferson, in fact, while he rejected miracles of Jesus, rejected the sacraments, etc., Jefferson took a Bible, he took several Bibles, by the way, and he took a penknife and he cut out all those parts of the Bible that he thought were mythology. And so, of course, any divine claims by Jesus, the sacraments, etc., all gone. But what remained was the moral teaching of Jesus. But Jefferson believed there was an enduring moral standard, and all of our Founding Fathers did.
Religion played a vital, indeed I would say an essential role in this regime of political self-government that they envisioned, that they were hoping to establish in these United States.
No one expresses this idea more clearly than George Washington in his famous farewell address in 1796, in which he says, "Of all the habits and dispositions which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports."
Now what's interesting, he goes on to say in the very next sentence, he says, "In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these firmest props of human happiness." Now think about that. He's saying if you're laboring to undermine this public role for religion, you can't call yourself a patriot. Because again, he starts from the proposition that religion and morality are indispensable to a regime of republican self-government.
A key factor in successfully navigating the intersection of church and state is allowing for religious reasoning to be a part of the public discourse. All citizens of the United States have the right to be engaged in respectful public discourse. But it's impossible to come into the public square and leave your religious convictions behind an artificially erected wall.
You know, I would argue that people of faith must be afforded the opportunity to engage in debate in the marketplace of ideas. That is fundamental to a democratic society. It's important that citizens be allowed to confront, to hear, and engage ideas from a variety of perspectives.
Most of us understand part of the founding of the United States, why people came here from other shores, was the freedom to practice their religion, the way they understood the religion to be. And that's one of the things, frankly, that makes the United States so wonderful, is that we are able to have, we don't have a theocracy, we have a multiplicity of religions, many of whom I don't even understand or know that much about, but I certainly believe in their right to practice them.
Yeah, it's important for loyal, faithful Christians who are also citizens of two kingdoms, citizens of the kingdom that is created at baptism, and then citizens also of this kingdom called the United States of America. It is really necessary for those citizens to be active in their local and federal government.
The error of assuming that I don't have a responsibility for this realm is an error. You can even say a heresy, because if you get the distinction right between the two realms, it's easy to see that, yes, I have a responsibility in the left hand, and there's no way I can be quiet. I need to be active.
And we undermine our democratic values when we say you can come to public debates and bring your political ideas, your ideological ideas, but you can't bring your religious ideas.
The church, especially the Christian church and the Christian worldview, has played a significant part in contributing to the social conscience of America, a conscience that has allowed democracy to thrive and provide religious liberty to people of all faiths.
Is America a Christian nation? Is that where we find ourselves today? Can the two-kingdom Christian worldview still impact how church and state live in a healthy, creative tension?
I think what makes America great is precisely that it's not a Christian nation. It's an atheist nation, it's a Muslim nation, it's a Jewish nation. I would disagree that America is a Christian nation, or ever has been.
From what I read in history books, I believe so, yes.
No. It's everybody.
I just would like to see a little more Christianity.
With a lot of the people who came to this country, a lot of different religious beliefs and practices came with them. And so I think they definitely, it's just a different place now.
But when it got down to actually doing the nation building with the work of the founding fathers, Madison and Jefferson and Franklin, these guys were driven much more by the principles of the Enlightenment than by Christian principles.
Have you ever heard anyone say that America is a Christian country because we have "In God We Trust" on our money? A lot of people believe that. Actually, it wasn't until the Civil War that those words were first struck on a 2-cent coin in 1864 because of increased religious sentiment. And it wasn't until 1883 that it was on all currency. And the phrase didn't become the motto of the United States until an act of Congress made it into the national motto in 1956. But that phrase predates the Civil War. I'm pretty sure that most of us could sing the first line of the Star-Spangled Banner from memory.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's
It's our national anthem. During the War of 1812, as the morning light revealed that the battle-torn American flag still flew above Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key wrote his poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry. It would later become known as the Star-Spangled Banner. In the fourth verse, which I've never heard anyone sing, it says, "Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." In the Pledge of Allegiance, the phrase "one nation under God" did not become a part of the pledge until 1954, after President Eisenhower heard a sermon by Reverend George Dougherty based on the Gettysburg Address titled "A New Birth of Freedom." The president was sitting in the pew that Abraham Lincoln used when he attended the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. The pastor argued that the nation's might lay not in arms, but its spirit and higher purpose. He noted that the pledge's sentiments could be those of any nation, but there was something missing in the pledge, and that which was missing was the characteristic and definitive factor in the American way of life. He cited Lincoln's words, "under God," as defining words that set the United States apart from other nations. The The next day, Congressman Charles Oakman, at the urging of Eisenhower, no doubt, introduced a bill in the House to include those words, and the new pledge was adopted on June 14, 1954. Today we celebrate that as Flag Day. Does that make America a Christian nation? Well, no. But as a limited federal government, that stands to reason. In fact, in 1797, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Tripoli. It was passed by a unanimous vote. In Article 11 of that treaty was this statement: "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion."
Now, the thing that gets confusing for many people, especially Christians today who want to make that argument that we are a Christian nation founded on Christian principles, is that there's a lot of overlap. Because the Enlightenment at the time of the Revolution and the founding of this country in the late 18th century, at that time, the Enlightenment was still compatible with a lot of Christian truth. There's a God, He holds us accountable, there is law, there is natural law. They agreed with all those things, and Christians agree with those things.
So while we cannot say that America is a Christian nation, for even Christianity would not speak of any nation as heaven on earth in those terms, the Founding Fathers would have been very comfortable saying that this nation is a nation of Christian people from a Christian worldview, trying to create a free and just society as free, self-governing, mostly Christian citizens.
The intersection of church and state has always been complicated. The question of whether we were founded to be a Christian nation is complex as well.
On the other hand, the church, people of faith, can and have contributed to the erosion of the relationship between church and state by not understanding the framework established by the Constitution, the responsibilities laid on them by the First Amendment.
When it comes to the interplay between government and religion, and in particular how the Constitution affects that today in America, I think Christians in particular have three main problems. Number one is ignorance. By that I mean we somehow love to repeat false statements without checking out the truthfulness of them. When someone says we can't have prayer in public school, or that our kids cannot pray in public school, that's just simply a false statement. If you repeat it often enough, teachers and school districts start believing it. That's one problem. The other problem is we're somehow led to believe that the Supreme Court has been unfriendly to religion and unfriendly to Christianity in particular. And you have to read these wonderful Supreme Court opinions that support religion and support Christianity, and then we need to praise those and stand up for them. The third problem, and it's a very serious one in my estimation, is when Christians seek more involvement from government than they should ask for. Government-sponsored prayers in school is okay if it's the kind of prayer you want, and therein lies the problem. But that's not to say that kids can't pray anytime they want to at school, over their meal, around the flagpole. They have every right to do that. It's called free speech. So part of the cultural problem I think we're having is that Christians have taken their faith inside the church walls, and it needs to come back onto the streets. Nothing prohibits us from expressing our faith in public. That includes government officials. And it certainly includes kids at school. If we're really concerned about the message of Christ, as opposed to the whether or not Christianity wins a lawsuit, we'll be erecting nativity scenes on our lawns all over the community. We'll be spreading God's word at Christmas through our words and actions. We would not be worried about our 10 square feet on the courthouse lawn.
Distinct from the time of the Founding Fathers, we now live in a secular culture that is heavily influenced by Darwinism. Not only the evolution of species, but the evolution of truth, and a morality defined by individual choice, moral relativism.
And from that, we have increasingly come to view truth as simply a construct. Truth is not something that comes from outside of us, some established, divinely given moral truth through reason or the Bible. Truth is something people make up.
But starting a little over 100 years ago, maybe 150 years ago, the The trend of intellectual thought was towards the concept of moral relativism.
Moral relativism means that there really is no final truth. Darwin believed that lower species evolved into higher species. And today, on the whole matter of truth, it is believed that absolute truth, moral truth, has evolved into choice. Today, truth is relative. There is no one truth. Because Darwin removed the first cause, as it were. He removed God from the equation of creation. At least when our founders put together the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they believed in the God of reason. They believed that there was truth that was beyond any of us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. All have certain unalienable rights. That was natural law. It was something that everybody believed was established truth that could not be questioned.
I think we do ourselves damage if we deny that there are basic fundamental values, some of which may in fact be informed by religious values that shape, inform the way in which our society operates and ways in which our government operates.
Today, for many people, the concern is that these religious values that were supposed to underpin the morality expected of the limited state are in fact being eroded. And with such erosion comes the loss of freedom that they were to protect.
With natural law now being questioned as the authority of our life together, collisions occur as we struggle to redefine or to recapture what our public moral law should be. These controversies are played out in our culture and in the courts. A high-profile example is the proposed new healthcare reform law, one which requires Catholic institutions to provide coverage for contraception, even though it violates their conscience.
Under the rule, women will still have access to free preventive care that includes contraceptive services, no matter where they work.
No one in the United States, no one, should ever be compelled by their government to choose between violating their religious beliefs and being penalized for refusing.
The issue here is forcing the church to provide it directly or indirectly in contravention of the church's teaching, and that's what we don't want to do. It's one thing when tax dollars pay for it, it's another thing when church dollars.
Actuaries have looked at this benefit. The Federal Employees Health Plan, when contraception was added to federal employees benefit, which is the largest employee group in the country, costed this as no cost, free, no cost, because adding contraception and having some employees take advantage of that coverage lowers the overall costs of the health plan.
So you're saying by not having babies born, we're going to save money in health care?
Providing contraception as a critical preventive health benefit for women and for their children reduces health.
Not having babies born is a critical benefit. This is absolutely amazing to me. I yield back.
Religious people on both sides of the aisle can agree or disagree on larger questions of health care, but both should be extremely distressed when the religious freedoms of anyone in America is threatened.
Dr. Mitchell.
Over the last decades, new rules of navigation, as seen in the HHS mandate, have affected the relationship of the intersection of church and state, with new values being forced upon the church as well as upon free, religious American citizens.
One case in 2012 went all the way to the Supreme Court.
The New York Times said of the Hosanna Taper decision that it was the most significant religious freedoms decision in decades.
The case involved a teacher at a church school of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in Michigan. Considered a minister of the church, the teacher was granted a leave of absence to receive treatment for narcolepsy. When the school denied her request to return to work, she sued the church for violating her rights.
Instead of following the process laid out by the church for dispute resolution, she went to the EEOC and filed suit.
The church school planned to have her return in the fall, having contracted a temporary replacement for the rest of the school year. Bringing suits like these are contrary to the teaching of the church, but the real issue in this matter asked, How much can the government be involved in the selection or removal of ministers in the church? The case made its way through the courts until it was argued before the United States Supreme Court in October 2011. Douglas Laycock spoke on behalf of the church school.
The churches do not set the criteria for selecting or removing the officers of government, and government does not set the criteria for selecting or removing officers of the church. She could have had a hearing in the Senate before decision makers who would have been independent of the local church. This court has repeatedly said churches can create tribunals for the governance of their officers.
I think your point is that it's none of the business of the government to decide what the substantial interest of the church is.
Leandra Krieger from the United States Department of Justice argued on behalf of the government against the church school. She argued that the government could indeed limit religious freedom, even limit the First Amendment, as long as it was for the public good.
The freedom of religious communities to come together to express and share religious belief is a fundamental constitutional right, but it's a right that must also accommodate important governmental interests in securing the public welfare.
Is there anything special about the fact that the people involved in this case are part of a religious organization?
We think that the analysis is one that the court has elaborated in other cases involving similar claims to autonomy, non-interference.
Is that a no? You say it's similar to other cases, right?
We think the basic contours of the inquiry are not different. We think how the inquiry plays out in particular cases may be.
It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. We're talking here about the Free Exercise Clause and about the Establishment Clause, and you say they have no special application?
The Supreme Court ruled 9-0 for the congregation.
These legal skirmishes unfortunately contribute to the entrenchment of a lack of trust and prevent a healthy collaboration between the church and the state working together on a community level. But one thing is for certain. The Founding Fathers would have been very uncomfortable for the federal government to be the final arbiter of such things. So can the First Amendment work in the modern day? Can church and state work together?
Well, I think they can. Yeah, you just have to have, everybody has to kind of have an open mind. And
so I think it could possibly work, but it's hard. It's hard to find that balance. So
I think that they're two completely separate categories, and I don't see a way for them to work together.
I think right now, I really do think we need the church. We need religion. We need some morals.
The fact of the matter is that church and state have a long history of healthy cooperation in very significant ways. They have intersected in the areas of education from grade schools to universities. They have worked together in public health care. Have you ever noticed that many hospitals still reflect their religious origins with names like St. Luke's, Jewish, Presbyterian, and the like? Adoptions, the placement of foster children in new homes, effective immigration services, and many other services are still performed by faith-based social service agencies for the sake of the public good. We have seen the spheres of church and state work particularly well for the betterment of human welfare, both domestically and around the world. An area where the church and state has a tradition of working well together is providing humanitarian relief.
We have 17 offices around the world, and Lutheran World Relief probably works in about 40 countries, and we're really proud of our partnership with the United States government.
Catholic Charities has a long history of working in partnership with the government. Today, our homeless services, our services to veterans, our services to the elderly in nursing homes and HUD-funded facilities is enormous all the way across the country. Almost every diocese in the country has some presence of Catholic Charities, and it depends on a partnership with government funding in order to make it work.
LIRS has an amazing record and history of extending welcome to newcomers in this land. It began in the period around World War II, when hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. And the leadership of LIRS and Lutherans in this country, with other people of faith, made a case to the U.S. government that we should be opening our nation to receive people displaced by war. As a result, hundreds of thousands of people who had been living in refugee camps in Germany, Italy, and Austria, were allowed to come to this country. And so the ministry and service we carried out was one of welcome and hospitality. We take to heart the calling and the story of the Good Samaritan, God's command to love the neighbors that God gives to us, not just the neighbors that we choose.
As you might expect, sometimes there are challenges and problems when religious groups work together with the state.
In some places, Illinois particularly, has taken on the notion that they recognize gay marriages, and as such, foster care service providers have to also recognize gay marriages in the selection of foster care and adoptive parents. Well, obviously, this was going to be difficult for Catholic Charities, and it's proven to be almost disastrous for us across the state of Illinois. Almost all of the Catholic Charities programs have now given up any foster care.
With the possibility of these sorts of collisions, why should religious organizations want to partner with the government or the government with religious organizations? Let's see.
Now, on the continent of Africa, the church and faith-based organizations are among the most trusted entities. I mean, people trust their Sunday school teachers, people trust their pastors, people trust their youth workers, people trust their deaconesses, people trust those volunteers working in local health dispensaries. And the United States government knows that and respects that. And to their credit, they find ways to channel money where it will make a positive impact.
The citizens of this great country decided that there are some people that have to be helped, some people that we have to care for. Always going to look at the children, the handicapped, those that are vulnerable, those that are sick. And the government does not have the resources, nor does it have, if you will, the mission to care for people in that way. Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, Salvation Army, we the social service providers, our mission is to provide that care, to care for those people. It's a good match, it's a good partnership.
We have a strong relationship and partnership with the U.S. government, and particularly with government agencies that support the resettlement process. And they choose to partner with us as a faith-based organization because, one, they know we do the work well. Two, they know that we're grounded in local communities. And three, they know the story of congregations and faith communities extending welcome, standing with newcomers, and accompanying them through the long and sometimes difficult process of integrating into American society.
In our mind, you can't separate, and in our teachings and in our tradition, in our history, you cannot separate works of charity, acts of charity, from the Catholic Church any more than you could our sacraments. It's who we are, it's what we are. Part of being Catholic means to be of service to the community.
Churches and faith-based organizations aren't just another service organization that comes and goes, that follows the dollars, that picks up and leaves and moves to new places to start new projects. Faith communities are ever present in local communities, rooted in those communities, a place of belonging and leadership in communities. And so the strength that partners like the U.S. government see in faith-based organizations in responding to human need here in the United States, including the needs of refugees and migrants, is because of those deep roots in the community, because of the respect of religious leaders and people of faith, because of the deep commitment to love our neighbor and to welcome the stranger.
Church and state began working together very early in our nation's history. In fact, they worked together during the Revolutionary War in the area of the military chaplaincy.
General George Washington saw great need and benefit to having military chaplains. It's important to have military chaplains for several reasons. The first is for the spiritual well-being of the service member and their families, particularly when you go in harm's way. There's nobody there except that chaplain to bring to you a word of comfort and hope. There's something to be said about faith-based pastoral care and counsel. It's different from what the world offers. Frankly, my personal experience has been that most soldiers, even those who are non-religious, at times of distress, want to hear something beyond the world's wisdom. They want to hear, what does it mean to be in a world where there's good and evil, and people die, and my friends die? How does God enter into that?
Intersections. While we may like to avoid them, they are an inescapable part of our lives as we move from one place to another. They're places where people are going in different directions. Sometimes they yield, and sometimes they take the right of way in order to safely navigate the intersection to get where they're going. It's not always easy. Sometimes there are collisions. It's the same at the intersection of church and state. At the intersection of the church and state, competing goals are negotiated. We've established that the Constitution did not provide for a wall of separation between church and state, but rather a protective barrier that limits the power of the federal government and unleashes the power of free, self-governing citizens to care for one another. Such a framework doesn't always provide for immediate solutions, but empowers the people to work together to make the best out of the broken world in which they live. The relationship between church and state is best described as an intersection. It's how we negotiate that intersection that is the key to a healthy society.
My goal is not a Christian America. My goal is a just America. I want an America that stands on justice, that fights for what is right, that upholds God's natural law. That would be quite fine. In fact, that's enough.
Government has a very important role, along with all of the church faith communities, to try to create what we would call the common good.
The state has to stay in its place and religion has to stay in its place. And this is what actually brought and led to, I believe, the greatest experiment of democracy on the planet, which is the kind of pluralism that we are allowed to experience here in the United States of America. The reason why United States of America is a place of democratic genius is because of the way we allow multiculturalism, and we allow all of this wonderful, robust immigration and all of these different kinds of groups to live side by side. And that is because religion is in its place and the government is in its place.
We've seen a lot of collisions between church and state recently, but it doesn't have to be that way. Informed by Luther's teaching of the two kingdoms, we see that the First Amendment does not build a wall of separation, but provides a framework within which we can successfully navigate the intersection of church and state. I'm Gregory Seltz. Thanks for joining us.
The Intersection of Church and State is a production of Lutheran Hour Ministries.